Nazi Germany claimed to be building a world order based on racial hierarchy, but its main partner in Asia, Imperial Japan, rejected that very idea. At the same time Hitler was enforcing anti-Jewish laws, Japan was issuing visas and protecting Jewish refugees. In December 1938, Japan's five-minister conference even declared that no Jew would be expelled from its territory or occupied land. So why did these two powers, split by ideology and race, decide to stand together? This wasn't a friendship, it was a marriage of convenience. Here, SY. A strange friendship on paper. At first glance, the partnership looked contradictory, even absurd. One government built its entire identity around the idea of protecting what it called a superior white race. The other openly celebrated its difference, rooted its strength in being distinctly non-European, and refused to measure itself by European standards of civilization. In simple terms, Berlin's ideology ranked much of the world as inferior, while Tokyo's leaders had no intention of being placed beneath anyone. How do you reconcile something so incompatible? You don't, not really. But both sides tried because they thought the trade-off brought something of immediate value. That attempt at formal unity began even before the well-known wartime pact. Berlin and Tokyo had already signaled a partnership back in 1936 with the Anti-Comintern Pact, a mutual stand presented as resistance against Soviet influence. 4 years later came the bigger step, the Tripartite Pact, signed on 27 September 1940 by Germany, Italy, and Japan. Its text declared that the three powers would support one another if attacked by a country not already at war, an intentional clause that pointed straight at the United States. On paper, it appeared sweeping, with hints of a new global order stretching from Europe to Asia. Other states were added later in name, but the core image was that of three powers promising mutual strength. The image, however, carried more weight than the reality behind it. Unlike the Allies, who coordinated strategies, pooled resources, and held regular meetings, the Axis trio had no real joint command. There were no shared war rooms, no unified planning, and very little trust across their leadership circles. Instead, cooperation was mostly reduced to gestures, limited exchanges of military technology, staged declarations, and promises never meant to be tested. It looked dramatic, but beneath the signatures, each power read its own interpretation into the words. For Japan, the pact functioned as insurance. The empire was locked in a long and draining war in China, bleeding resources and pressed hard by Western restrictions. American embargoes on oil and steel especially threatened Japan's position. Attaching its name to the pact was less about shared ideology and more about sending a signal that it was part of a broader bloc. The message to Washington and London was clear. Pressure us, and you risk provoking not only Japan but also Hitler in Europe. It was meant to buy breathing space and deter escalation. Germany's motivations were different but equally practical. Hitler's government understood perfectly well that Japan was not embracing Nazi racial theories, but bringing Tokyo into the fold gave the appearance of a global coalition, stretching across continents and projecting an image of immense scope. To Germany, the pact was valuable precisely because it disguised how narrow and racially exclusive Nazi ideology actually was. Better to flaunt a worldwide partner than emphasize divisions that could weaken the image of inevitability the regime wanted to project. Italy, meanwhile, occupied a smaller role in the trio. Mussolini sought relevance. The Mediterranean ambitions of his state were already under strain, and aligning with Berlin and Tokyo gave the impression that Italy was still part of a larger script. For Rome, inclusion meant stature more than substance. The hollowness of the alliance showed quickly. Nazi officials expected not just tactical support, but also ideological solidarity. If Germany built its internal and external policies around persecuting Jews, shouldn't partners echo that stance? By that logic, Japan too should comply. But from the outset, Tokyo made no move to enforce anything resembling anti-Jewish restrictions. Instead, Japanese leaders consistently defined their own path. They not only refused to persecute Jews in their occupied territories, but also openly dismissed Berlin's pressure to synchronize in this area. Germany tolerated this defiance because it had little choice. The Japanese refusal revealed to both sides that their bond was one of convenience, not conviction. Berlin valued the illusion of breadth more than ideological consistency. Tokyo valued the aura of solidarity more than policy alignment. Both sides were willing to overlook contradictions if the arrangement served their own end. The contradiction was not hidden. Leaders in both countries acknowledged it in conversations and official communications, yet still allowed the pact to stand. That reveals the nature of the agreement, outwardly a show of unity, inwardly a calculation that each partner could use the other's name when needed. Each government spoke the language of cooperation, but neither was compelled to reshape its society or military posture to satisfy the other. When stripped of appearances, the Tripartite Pact was political theater at a global scale. Spectators abroad might see a formidable machine, but in practice the components did not mesh. For Germany, global presence was enough. For Japan, international cover mattered more than promises it might never fulfill. For Mussolini, publicity outweighed function. The pact symbolized ambition without depth. This imbalance shaped the entire wartime relationship. Without unified command structures, the Axis powers fought largely independent wars. Their occasional gestures of aid or praise were more ceremonial than coordinated. Their strategies developed in parallel rather than in tandem. By contrast, the Allies demonstrated constant consultation, shared resources, and deliberate planning across continents. The Axis never reached that level. The superficiality carried consequences. An alliance dominated by self-interest cannot withstand pressure for long. At the very moment it was announced, practical divisions undermined its meaning. From Japan's dismissal of Nazi racial demands to Germany's tolerance of that contradiction, the arrangement revealed itself not as a foundation, but as an improvisation. Its value lay in how it looked from the outside, not in how it functioned from within. And therein lies one of its most revealing aspects. The pact highlighted the difference between ideology and necessity. Germany, the state most vocal about ideology, compromised it quickly to secure Tokyo's partnership. Tokyo, while pragmatic, carried on with its own agenda unaffected by German expectations. Both put appearances before integrity. When observed closely, the pact reads more as a bluff than as a blueprint for common action. But that bluff required constant explanation, especially from Berlin. Within Germany, Hitler and his officials had built identity politics on strict racial hierarchies. Now they stood beside an Asian power that did not fit the Nazi vision at all. Reconciling that gap meant inventing justifications, bending doctrine, and twisting language in ways that exposed the fragility of Nazi claims. Germany labels its ally Honorary Aryans. When Germany tried to present Japan as a valued ally, it ran headfirst into a problem. The entire Nazi worldview revolved around rigid racial hierarchies, yet Japan sat firmly outside those categories. Hitler had spent years declaring that Germany's strength came from protecting Aryan blood, isolating lesser peoples as threats to survival. Now he needed to justify standing shoulder to shoulder with a nation he had once excluded. The solution was not a legal amendment or a new statute, but an improvised fiction. The Japanese were spoken of as Honorary Aryans. This label was never written into law in the way the Nuremberg decrees systematized anti-Jewish policy. It worked more as a rumor, a rhetorical device, and a bureaucratic gray zone. Nazi officials quietly extended exemptions when needed, especially to avoid embarrassing scenes with Japanese nationals living inside Germany. Administrative ambiguity allowed propagandists to speak as if the Japanese were special, without actually dismantling the racial categories that underpinned the regime. In practice, it was favoritism disguised as theory. Even within the government, the question sparked argument. Internal memoranda from the German-Japanese Society, DJG, noted that policy kept being deferred, and Nazi racial theorists such as Johann von Leers clashed with Walter Gross of the Office of Racial Policy over whether the Japanese could be honored or not. Berlin's approach was to avoid settling the issue. Instead of issuing a ruling, officials left the matter suspended, trusting that propaganda and selective exemptions would paper over the contradiction. This is part of why the notion of Honorary Aryans persisted. It was never clarified, so it was repeated. For the German public, the explanations were packaged as though everything aligned perfectly. Propaganda presented the Japanese as disciplined, noble allies standing with Germany in a global struggle. They were described as loyal and militarily capable, proof that certain exceptions could be made without abandoning principle. The framing stopped short of equality, but insisted on special recognition, giving citizens an easy way to accept the alliance without openly confronting the contradiction. The weakness of the logic came through in how easily the rules bent. A racial ideology that claimed hard scientific legitimacy suddenly had space for honorary upgrades. What had been defined as absolute categories became, in reality, conditional. The analogy is simple. It was like inventing a rule and then carving out privileges for VIPs to bypass it. Exceptions were made not because of principle, but because power demanded it. This flexibility was never only for domestic reassurance. Diplomatic considerations weighed heavily. Alienating Tokyo with overt racism could have endangered the alliance entirely, and Berlin knew it lacked leverage to force Japan into adopting Nazi racial policies. Japanese leaders openly dismissed German pressure regarding Jews, leaving Hitler with little choice but to flatter rather than dictate. By circulating honorary status, Nazi officials signaled that Japan was valued and that the partnership was worth more than rigid consistency. The irony is that Japan itself placed little importance on this honorary label. Japanese identity did not rely on European categories, and officials in Tokyo required no validation from Nazi ideology. If anything, the designation revealed more about Germany's anxieties than Japan's ambitions. Where Berlin tried to smooth an internal inconsistency with symbolic upgrades, Tokyo continued to shape policy independently, never adjusting to accommodate German racial thinking. Inside Germany, however, propaganda amplified the phrase. Newspapers and speeches repeated the idea as though it carried weight, masking the fact that no legislation secured it. Citizens were asked to accept the narrative that Japan was unlike other non-European peoples, that discipline, cultural strength, and loyalty elevated them above categories otherwise condemned. Many accepted the story, not because it was consistent, but because Nazi ideology encouraged obedience over scrutiny. What this produced was a peculiar sleight of hand. By dressing Japan in honorary language, the regime claimed it was not softening its racial worldview, but rather confirming it through recognition of select allies. The paradox was inverted into evidence of strength. If ideology seemed flexible, the propaganda machine turned that into proof of confidence. Questions about coherence seldom arose because the public was being trained to admire decisions rather than evaluate them. Seen from outside, the logic was transparently hollow. It reduced blood theory to a political convenience, undermining the very racial science that the Nazis insisted was objective. Yet inside the Third Reich, the label accomplished its goal. It stopped the contradictions from turning into open challenges, and it preserved the illusion that Germany's doctrine was intact even as it warped. This honorary recognition demonstrates how ideology faltered the moment it collided with strategic need. Hitler's obsession with purity did not block him from embracing Japan. It simply forced his regime to invent a way to argue that Japan was an exception. It was a tacit admission that ideology alone could not secure alliances, but the designations also highlight the imbalance within the Axis. Japan needed material resources and breathing room. Germany needed the appearance of a global partner. The honorary status showed who was bending more. It was Berlin, not Tokyo, that scrambled to adjust. Nazi leaders softened definitions in desperation to preserve unity, while Japan ignored Berlin's most radical demands without consequence. In the end, the honorary Aryan device was a patch. It covered an ideological wound without healing it. German citizens heard of Japan's special role, officials avoided issuing binding definitions, and propaganda kept contradictions from boiling over. Nothing about it was formalized, but its repetition in speeches and directives made it seem real enough to function. This moment tells us more than just how Nazi Germany treated Japan. It shows how any rigid ideology can erode in the face of necessity. A theory celebrated as unshakable collapsed into a set of exceptions when circumstances demanded cooperation. The survival of an alliance mattered more than fidelity to doctrine, so rules bent while officials pretended nothing had changed. And while Germany was inventing categories to excuse its partnership, Tokyo was pursuing its own course. This becomes clearest when we turn to an area where the divide between the two allies stood out most starkly: responses to Jewish refugees in the years when Europe was expelling them. Japan and the Jews, an unexpected sanctuary. While Germany stretched its ideology to justify the alliance, Japan was shaping its reputation in an entirely different way, by becoming, in practice, a transit point and temporary refuge for Jewish refugees. At the very moment when Europe was closing borders and turning away ships, Japan's policies created openings that thousands of people used to survive. It was an outcome that exposed just how far apart Berlin and Tokyo were when it came to questions of race and persecution. The foundation of this stance lay in an explicit government directive. On December 6, 1938, the so-called Five Ministers' decision made clear that Jews would not be expelled from Japanese territory or from areas under Japanese military control. This was not a casual oversight, but an official anchor repeated throughout the war, even when Nazi officials urged Tokyo to adopt harsher measures. Where Berlin demanded conformity, Japan held on to its own priorities and declined to follow Germany's path. Far from a secret policy, this framework allowed refugees to reach ports under Japanese jurisdiction and, at least temporarily, escape the fate awaiting them in Europe. One of the most remarkable episodes within this story involves Chiune Sugihara, Japan's vice-consul in Kaunas, Lithuania. Working in 1940 as Nazi pressure spread through Eastern Europe, he used his diplomatic post to issue roughly 1,800 transit visas that let Jewish families travel through the Soviet Union into Japan. These visas became lifelines, often the only pieces of paper standing between families and destruction. Sugihara defied instructions in order to keep writing them, sometimes by hand for long stretches every day. The sheer scale of his action went beyond a symbolic gesture. Thousands owed their survival to those documents. Decades later, his role was formally recognized when Israel honored him as righteous among the nation. His choices did not establish Japan's overall refugee policy, but they showed how the absence of institutional anti-Semitism in Japan created space for life-saving individual decision. Tokyo's policymakers never pretended their position came from moral conviction alone. Alongside humanitarian instincts, practical concerns played a large role. Some planners looked at Jewish immigration as a way to acquire skills, capital, and international links useful to Japan's own agenda. Out of this climate came talk of the so-called Fugu Plan, an idea that Jewish communities might be settled in Japanese-occupied territories if managed carefully. The comparison to the pufferfish suggested that Jewish influence could be either beneficial or dangerous, depending on how it was handled. Historians still debate how seriously this idea was pursued or how concrete the proposals actually became. But the very fact they were considered highlights the difference in outlook. Where Berlin saw Jews only as an extermination target, Tokyo sometimes saw leverage or opportunity. Even without such schemes being realized, Japan's role as a corridor of escape proved significant. Families traveled across the Soviet Union by train to Vladivostok, boarded ships to Kobe, and from there sometimes continued on to destinations like Shanghai. Under Japanese occupation, Shanghai became home to tens of thousands of refugees. Conditions there were far from ideal. The designated area for stateless persons was overcrowded, resources were tight, and several thousand refugees lost their lives under those harsh circumstances. Yet compared to extermination camps and ghettos in Europe, the survival rate was dramatically better, and the very possibility of building communities in exile underscored the contrast with Germany's policy. The difference did not go unnoticed. German diplomats repeatedly pressed their ally to impose restrictions, to confine or even deport Jewish refugees in line with Nazi policy. Yet Japan held to the 1938 decision: no expulsion, no adoption of racial laws. Officials were willing to maintain police oversight in Shanghai, but they did not replicate Germany's extermination program. This was not a small rift. It cut into the heart of Nazi ideology, where international cooperation in persecuting Jews was supposed to be automatic. Instead, Tokyo treated Berlin's demands as irrelevant to its own national interest. This raises the question of motivation. Was Japan acting from compassion? In reality, the drivers were pragmatic. Leaders believed anti-Semitic campaigns brought no practical benefit and risked alienating influential communities abroad, particularly in the United States. Tolerating Jewish refugees cost little compared to the potential diplomatic and economic gains it might provide. Japan's foreign minister at the time, Yasuke Matsuoka, even remarked that while he supported alignment with Hitler politically, he had never promised to import Germany's anti-Jewish program. That distinction may have seemed minor at the moment, but it defined the lives of thousands who passed through Japan's sphere of control. Refugees experienced this divergence in the most immediate ways. For those clutching Sugihara's transit visas in their hands, boarding the Trans-Siberian Railway was the first step toward safety. For families arriving in Kobe or Shanghai, daily realities were difficult but not annihilating. Cultural institutions sprang up, synagogues functioned, and networks of relief supported survival under occupation. It was survival on the margins. But in the middle of World War II, that difference meant everything. The broader irony is stark. Germany bent its racial ideology to declare Japan an exception. Japan ignored that ideology completely, and in the process, created channels that prevented Germany's plans from achieving total reach. Each side adapted in opposite ways, Berlin making up honorary categories to save face, Tokyo standing apart by refusing to import anti-Semitism as policy. Together, those adaptations revealed that the so-called Axis unity offered little more than appearances. In the end, Jewish refugees found pathways to live because Japan pursued its own interests rather than Nazi doctrine. It was not a program of rescue in the noble sense, but it functioned as one in practice. The reality of safe transit and temporary settlement pointed to a deeper truth. Japan's decisions were guided less by ideology and more by strategic calculation. That lens, pragmatism over principle, explains not only its treatment of Jewish refugees, but also much of its behavior within the Axis partnership as a whole. And to see the alliance clearly, we have to focus on what Tokyo actually wanted and why those objectives mattered more than any borrowed racial theory. What Japan really wanted. Japan's position inside the Axis only makes sense once we set aside Germany's racial theories and look at what Tokyo actually needed. In the late 1930s, Japanese leaders were far less concerned with ideology than with the material question of how to feed their empire and sustain their military. Their population was large, their army and navy powerful, but their islands lacked the basic resources to keep the war machine running. Oil, iron, and rubber all had to be imported. For years, the largest supplier had been the United States, making Tokyo deeply vulnerable if Washington ever decided to cut trade. Every new battlefront widened that vulnerability, forcing policymakers to face the reality that their national ambitions depended on supplies they did not control. Nowhere was this problem clearer than in the war with China. What Japanese leaders had hoped might be a quick victory became a years-long conflict that consumed staggering amounts of ammunition, fuel, and steel. Military reports warned that with each passing month of fighting, Japan's reliance on foreign shipments increased. At first, those shipments continued to arrive. Even with American disapproval of Japanese aggression, goods kept crossing the Pacific. But Tokyo could see the mood shifting. Members of the US government began calling for restrictions, and oil was the most alarming target. Japanese naval staff estimated that if a full embargo were imposed, the country would have only about 6 months' worth of usable reserves left. That number, grounded in their own planning documents, gave urgency to every decision that followed. Securing independence from Western-controlled resources was no longer an option to be pursued at leisure. It was an immediate survival concern. Against that backdrop, the Tripartite Pact looks less like a meeting of ideological allies and more like an attempt to buy time. By putting their name on paper alongside Hitler and Mussolini, Japanese leaders hoped to raise the diplomatic cost of intervention. If Washington or London moved to cut off resources, Tokyo wanted them to hesitate for fear of creating a larger war. In practice, Japan doubted Germany could send significant help in Asia, but the mere perception mattered. From Tokyo's perspective, every week of continued access to oil and iron imports allowed them to keep fighting in China and to prepare for the possibility of striking south into resource-rich colonies. Japan's whole empire-building program had already been driven by the need for materials. The 1931 conquest of Manchuria was framed as liberation, but functioned as a resource colony, with iron ore, coal, and food channeled into the home islands. The 1937 invasion of China expanded that reach even further. But even that was not enough to replace shipments from the United States. Military planners knew that only Southeast Asia held deposits and plantations on the scale required to achieve security. Dutch-controlled oil fields in the East Indies, British rubber in Malaya, and tin and bauxite spread across the region represented exactly what Japan lacked. Capturing them would mean an industrial base free from Western trade. Here, the logic of the alliance becomes clearer. Germany's signature was not expected to bring troops to the Pacific. Instead, it was useful as a cloud of uncertainty. If Japan moved to seize Southeast Asia, any Western intervention might now be seen as risking a two-front confrontation in Europe and in Asia against supposedly united powers. For Tokyo, that illusion was worth the ink on the document. It promised time to secure a southern strategy without immediate retaliation. The focus on oil cannot be overstated. By mid-1941, after occupying French Indochina, Japan finally faced the embargo its leaders had long dreaded. Imports of oil and other critical goods from the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands ground to a halt. The 6-month estimate of reserves moved from theory to alarming reality. At that point, the gamble of empire became unavoidable.